So I just want to start off by thanking Nestor for being gracious enough to give me the opportunity to share a very short story. It's going to be a very concise story, under 10-minute story, a selection of many of the stories in a book I recently published called The Mexican Revolution in Chicago, which is about the political activism and assimilation of Mexican immigrants from the 1900s to the 1950s. This is my timer. All right, so let me contextualize my story just a little bit. So between 1900 and 1929, about 1.5 million Mexicans immigrated into the United States. And usually I speak to a wide range of crowds, and usually when I say that number, there are people in the audience whose just eyes get big and they say, wow, that's a lot of Mexicans. And what they don't understand is that starts during the era of European immigration to the United States. Between 1820 and 1920, that's sort of the era of European immigration to the United States. That's when anywhere between 25 to 50 million Europeans came to the United States. And the bulk of those came from roughly 1905 to World War I, when anywhere between 700,000 to 1 million Europeans were coming to the United States per year. To give you a sense of what that means in terms of comparison, today Chicago's maybe 25% foreign born. In 1860, before the Civil War even starts, the city's more than 50% foreign born. By 1890, if you count the European immigrants and their children, the city is nearly 79% foreign born. But the real difference is those are European immigrants. And the 25% that I'm speaking about today, really, or that I'm sort of contextualizing this, is really about Latin American immigrants. So between that 1900 to 1930, about 1.5 million come into this country. And by the 1920s, there's a group of Mexicans arriving in Chicago that define themselves as liberals. That's how they call themselves. And they're very proud liberals who say, we represent parliamentarian democracy, democratic rights, we believe in universal suffrage, we believe in education for all. And they're very anti-dictatorship because they are galvanized by the fact they had just participated in overthrowing the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in Mexico, a 35-year dictatorship. So these Mexicans arrive in Chicago as sort of democratic, liberal political activists. And when they get here, they are just horrified by how brutal working class Mexicans live. They're just horrified by it. So what do they start to do? They start engaging in all kinds of social welfare activities. They start bereavement funds for Mexicans who die on job sites. They start injury sort of funds for those who get hurt. And they start educational programs to teach both the Spanish and English language to immigrants who are interested in education and in sort of economic upward mobility. And they're doing this at a time when the government and the city of Chicago is not really offering these types of services. And one of the things the liberals notice that really horrifies them is the way American politicians, intellectuals, and local newspapers talk about Mexican immigrants. The Chicago Daily Tribune in the 1920s refers to Mexican immigrants as primitive people, ignorant people, uneducated people, barbaric people, people who don't know anything about democracy, people who don't know anything about living in civil society. And these liberals are just horrified by this. So they start organizing study groups and fraternal societies, and they start publishing newspapers to challenge the way that they're talked about. And one of the things they start to assess is sort of how bound up US citizenship is with the concept of race and really the concept of whiteness. So when I usually speak to historians, if I ask them, we all know sort of what's significant about the Declaration of Independence, 1776, all men are created equal. Everybody sort of roughly knows that. But if I say to the audience of historians, do you all know what's significant about the first Naturalization Act signed by George Washington himself in 1790, what it stipulates as to who is qualified for US federal citizenship? For example, does anybody in this room maybe know? So this is the first Naturalization Act of 1790. You need to be a, quote, that's right, a, quote, free white person, end quote, in order to qualify for US federal citizenship. This is our first Naturalization Act in 1790, which is qualifying the Declaration. Everybody knows the significance of the Declaration, but very, very few people know the significance of that very first Naturalization Act. And what the liberals start saying is, well, as mixed race people, as people of indigenous heritage, etc., we are never really going to be treated as first-class citizens in this society. So they start drawing on Mexican intellectuals of the 1920s, intellectuals who are changing the way all Latin Americans see themselves. They start drawing on the writings of Jose Vasconcelos, who publishes The Cosmic Race in 1925. They start drawing on the writings of people like Isidro Fabela, who publishes The United States Against Liberty in 1920. And they're drawing on these Mexican intellectuals to make sense of themselves, to defend themselves in the US context, and to begin talking about what they say nobody wants to talk about, the other side of immigration. That is, what I find is in the United States, we tend to talk about immigration as a one-way migration, a one-way street. People from all over the world come here, but we don't really seem to incorporate into our discussions the degree to which we as Americans have historically always gone there, and the degree to which what we do there often creates the very conditions that then incentivizes and at times prods and forces people to then come here. And so these Mexicans start assessing what the writings are of these Mexican intellectuals, and they start talking about the presence of US corporations and military bases in Mexico and Latin America in the 1920s. By 1910, there's more than 75,000 Americans living throughout Mexico. And these Americans aren't renting apartments or they're not buying single-family homes. No, these Americans are buying thousands of acres of land. I mean, they're buying mines, plantations, they're buying oil fields. They're fundamentally transforming the economy, the political system, and the environment of Mexico and the Latin American countries in which they enter. And the irony here is that at my university, I'm often asked to apply to foundations, like let's say the Hearst Foundation, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Doheny Foundation. In fact, if anybody in here ever wants to name a foundation, I'll tell you when that foundation and the families went into Latin America in the 1800s and how much wealth they extracted from there to put us in today's position where I now apply to them to study immigration and poverty in Latin America. I mean, if I were to just give you like one quick example, like if I were to just pick one off the top of my head, I was recently encouraged to apply to the Hearst Foundation for a grant. Well, in the late 1800s, US Senator George Hearst, a senator, partners with his son William Randolph Hearst, and enters Mexico, and they start acquiring land in the state of Chihuahua. And they work with that dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz in order to do that. And they acquire over 1.6 million acres of land, which they use to run a massive and profitable cattle ranching operation. So I mean, this is what we're talking about. We're not talking about, like I said, thousands. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of acres. We're talking about transforming places as sort of enclave cities. So as the liberals begin debating this, they start saying, we don't really discuss the Americans that are there as part of our discussion of immigration here. And they start wanting to insert the Americans into the equation. They start talking about race, and they start talking about the way US citizenship is so bound up with the concept of whiteness, and they start criticizing these things. And then things get very real in the Chicago context, as these Mexicans in the 1920s, I'm not talking about the 1960s here, which we know a lot about. In the 1920s, they start partnering with Puerto Ricans and Nicaraguans. And as they partner with the Central Americans and the Caribbean nationals, those groups make these discussions that Mexicans are having about US foreign practices and policies very real, because over the course of the 1800s, we occupy Nicaragua multiple times, and Puerto Ricans are largely occupied and told you do not have the right to be an independent nation state, and you do not have the right to be an actual full member of the United States. And so the Puerto Ricans and the Nicaraguans really personalize the criticisms that these Mexican liberals are starting to develop. And the liberals become quite disillusioned with the United States and with their Chicago experience, because they thought they were entering this liberal democracy. And they're sort of horrified when they start sort of seeing how that operates in practice. And they start criticizing this, and they start building a community, and they start building a movement to inform everybody about this. Because at their core, actually, what the liberals often said, which is pretty positive and is pretty profound, is they often said, if the average American actually knew what their government and what their corporations do below the United States, they would be horrified and they would oppose those policies and practices, but they just don't know. So they begin trying to inform the public of this. And as this starts happening, as they start building the movement, as the momentum starts building, the Great Depression happens. And the Great Depression largely bankrupts the liberal movement. The liberal movement was based on Mexican and Central American small proprietors. These people owned businesses throughout Chicago, which allowed them to use finances to produce their own Spanish language newspapers, to create events like this in the 1920s and to discuss all of the themes that I've been discussing. And as the Great Depression hits them, it starts bankrupting them. But then to add to that, politicians and intellectuals who have already been denigrating Latin American immigrants now start calling for their mass deportation. And it's in the context of that Great Depression that we deport well over 400,000 Latin American immigrants. And as the liberals start seeing that they're being targeted for deportation in the way Italian immigrants, Polish immigrants, Slavic immigrants, and others are not, it just sort of confirms to them that this is not a place that is ever going to treat them as first-class citizens. And in the context of that depression, the liberal movement collapses, many of them get deported, and as they get deported, their histories and their stories get deported with them. So that to this day, if you pick up most books on Mexican Chicago, you won't find a lot of the stories of the Mexican liberals that I just told. And in the end, that community does bounce back, and it starts doing things. But that's a story for another day, and those are stories that you can find in my book. Thank you very much.